everyone. Welcome. I'm Jan Mercer-Doms, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. We are an ecosystem of brands for women by women, connecting women to each other and to the companies, causes, and organizations that champion equity for women professionally and personally. You're here with us today watching our Women in Money show, brought to you each and every week. And please make sure to check us out at Join Mayshad and our YouTube channel for all of our episodes. I'm so thrilled and honored for this conversation today because, Shelley, you have such an incredible backstory. So, ladies and gentlemen, Shelley Brindle. Hi, Shelley, welcome.
Hi, Jan. Thank you so much for inviting me here today.
You're so very welcome. Shelley is the first mayor of Westfield, New Jersey, and also spent almost 27 years in C-suite roles at HBO, most recently as Executive Vice President of Domestic Network Distribution and Marketing. Shelley, first question I have to ask you. Talk to us about the transition that you embarked on, your own personal journey from transitioning from HBO to deciding to run for mayor.
Yeah, it's quite a story, and I wish it was as intentional as you might make it sound. But sometimes the things that the best things that happen are those that can't be planned. So as you mentioned, I had been at HBO for a really long time. I was the first woman in the C-suite there, the first one with an operating job. And I was very lucky when I started HBO to have joined a company that was on a growth trajectory in an industry that was very dynamic and evolving from when it was back then. So I was very lucky to be and land in a place where our culture was so aligned with my values. And so all those things together enabled me to just continue to grow and expand and innovate at a company along with its own, journey. And so I had been part of every innovation that HBO had ventured forward, certainly on the business and the technology side, and then ultimately ending with the launch of our streaming services at the time, HBO Go, and then HBO Now. And very candidly, so we were launching those services. I was turning 50. My contract was up, and we had employment contracts at that level. And it's funny, when they offered me a new 4-year contract, it really makes you stop and pause and reflect about what you want those next 4 years to look like. And especially, I think, as you approach 50 and you start thinking about, okay, how many more years do I have on this planet to really do something meaningful, or quite frankly, pivot to a whole nother chapter. And I had felt so accomplished in what we had just done. I couldn't imagine that there would be anything in the next 4 years that were going to be as really rewarding and challenging as what I had just come through. And I started honestly thinking about my eulogy. And I knew if I'd stayed another 4 years, that was probably going to be the big, then I'd go on to do really, kind of not very interesting things. And I kept thinking about my eulogy and what people would say about me. And at that moment, I felt like my CEO would be delivering the eulogy. It would be all HBO employees, and we'd be talking about, how I got Game of Thrones on your iPhone. And I don't know, I just felt that's great, but that's not really in life how I wanted to be remembered. And so I decided to leave without knowing what the next chapter was going to look like. But knowing that I needed some space between that role and kind of where I was to kind of figure it out. So that was the impetus behind me leaving. And then I was giving a lot of talks on growth and innovation and how you create cultures of innovation. And I've lived in my town for 25 years. It's a beautiful historic town of Westfield, New Jersey. Like many of these downtowns, they're struggling with how to pivot from shopping and brick and mortar shopping to becoming a vibrant experiential downtown. And one day I was in town like 11 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, and which I typically wasn't there because I was commuting in the city. I had 3 kids at home. And I said, oh my gosh, here I am talking about growth and innovation of all these other places. And it looks like the place that needs some growth and innovation the most is right in my own backyard. So then I just started paying attention, and one thing led to another. And the next thing you know, be careful when you speak up, because that's when people are like, well, why did you just run for mayor? So anyway, here I am.
Well, and you're the first female mayor of your city, of your town. But also you were elected during a historic moment in time for your community as well, in the sense of really being a part of more of a massive transformation of change, in the sense of kind of a shift in political power, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But talk to me a bit about what that was like as well, to be a part of something so historic in that moment in time.
Yeah, I have to tell you, of all the things I'd ever done in my career, the hardest thing I ever did was running for office. And it's that kind of thing. If you knew how hard it was, would you have done it? And there are several reasons. And regardless of your political persuasion, but I'm a Democrat, and our town is a historic Republican town. And I would say this even if it was flipped the other way, there were 9 Republicans and 0 Democrats on the council, and it had been that way for years. It was a very old boys network, and many decisions were made behind closed doors. And honestly, I wasn't that engaged in my community, as were many others. It's a great school system. It's a beautiful downtown, but you just felt like it was a place that you didn't belong. And I will say it was that election of 2016, which said, if you want to make a change, get out the clipboard and get some signatures and run for office. I don't know if I would have even considered that as something I would have done if it hadn't been for that election. But also, if I didn't feel like our town was in desperate need of change, I didn't want to run for mayor just to be the mayor. I wanted to run for mayor to drive change in my community. So it was, and I will tell you what was really great about it is I had 50 high school kids that really are the ones that got me elected. And my daughter was a high school senior at the time, and they were all in school, and she got all her friends, and they were out there. They really were responsible for getting me elected, and they did a whole text thing. They got these directories, and they found out who had been in the class the previous 4 years, who they knew were in college, and they started this whole texting of vote registration and vote by mail. And what I was very proud of, I was running against a 3-term incumbent. So it was, I didn't realize how much money that they would put into this race to make sure I didn't win. But those kids that did that, we had the highest voter turnout in the state. We had the highest vote by mail turnout in the state. And I told those high school kids, I said, you guys did that. I said, they did that. And honestly, I was getting those numbers prior to even the election returns, like a week before. And at that point, it didn't even matter if I won, because I felt like these kids were so proud of the difference they were making. And that was going to propel them to do other great things in their lives. I felt like I'd already won before Election Day. So
I love that story. It's so inspirational. And it really, I think it gives us all hope that the next generation of leaders, no matter if in politics or academia or in business, like there's something so passionate about what they really believe in, right? And something so genuine about being really connected to the cause and really wanting to impact positive change.
And I think what was really important is that they were actually able to see and measure their impact. And I think when you see that, it only inspires you to keep going. And so that was pretty incredible. And then I'd run into their parents, I don't know, their farmers market, other place who I didn't even know, and they'd come up to me and they said, I want you to know that my daughter's now pursuing like public health because of her experience with you. Or our class valedictorian was she was a math statistician, wanted to go into working on gerrymandering. So that to think that experience might impact what trajectory they take in their life going forward was worth it for me in that regard.
At the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned how, the shift from kind of retail brick and mortar in the sense of how we think about like a downtown, right? Or where people come to congregate and
right.
participate in some sort of experience, to moving more toward a more fulfilling lived experience. How has that, you were elected in 2017?
2017, yeah.
How has that, your desire to create different experiences for residents, How has it evolved? And how do you think now that we're kind of still in the middle of COVID, in what ways will COVID continue to shape how community residents think about lived experiences? Because look, like I live in Chappaqua, outside of the city, used to commute in every day. There are probably fewer than 50 cars in the train station parking lot every day. So we're all kind of working from home, right? And so I think that the stories that you share are very relevant to many towns that are filled with commuters, because we're the blend between work and home and our professional lives is going to evolve and continue to evolve going forward in ways that we never imagined 6 months ago.
Right. And I think that's a great question. And I think one of the things that I'm fascinated by through all of this is what permanent changes will be impacted or will we make as a society, right? Whether it be education, healthcare, communities, all that kind of stuff. And I tend to be a very half glass full person. And I always like to lean into things. And so it's like, as horrible as this is, for me, what's enabled me to keep a really positive outlook is to see what some of these changes can be made permanent. In our community, it's quite remarkable. I feel like buying local has become a philanthropic exercise, right? And everybody feels this responsibility to keep our businesses in operating mode. So that, I think, this whole shop local and stay local, I don't think that's going away even post COVID. And I actually think this notion of this hybrid work model, I do think people go back to commuting, but my guess is it'll be 2 or 3 times a week. That's really good for communities, right? Like that. And so I think there's some real benefit. A lot of the stuff that we've done, like a lot of communities, creating open streets and, putting our outside dining all over the place. It's very European and it feels great. And I'm hopefully looking at already what are these things that we can maintain permanent, because those things build community. When you're out and you're just running into each other, and that's something you can't get online. And I think that is really what's going to be the mainstay post-COVID. Is I think community is going to be more important, and those types of experiences are what people are going to be craving. And I think it's going to make our a further engagement commitment to local that maybe wasn't the case prior.
Do you think also because of this, then even more women may be interested in becoming more involved with the political landscape of their local communities? I think that so many of us think about politics still at that national level, but there are a lot of opportunities to stay engaged and be engaged and play more of a vital role at local levels.
Yeah, I actually think that COVID is going to provide a turning point for women and to attain positions of influence across the spectrum. And it's funny, and one of the things I spoke about prior to COVID, and certainly in my post-HBO job, is that, I used to talk about women and why so many women are leaving the workforce, right? And it's like, why aren't women staying? And it's and why aren't there more women in the C-suite? And I'll be honest with you, I felt like a lot of the efforts behind trying to get women in the C-suite were a little bit misdirected. Because when you ask me why aren't there more women in the C-suite or the C-level, and quite frankly, the honest, brutal answer is because they don't want to be. Because they don't want to be based upon how those jobs have been defined always by the men that held them, right? And they weren't, and I think there's studies that show that men and women start out equally ambitious. You get to kind of mid-career and men stay equally ambitious and women's ambitions wanes. And I think it's because you get kind of to a certain level and you start to see what it takes to get to the top. And you're like, women have, I think, a broader holistic definition of success. It includes, sure, career, professional success. It also includes, community aspects. It includes family and parents and all those things. And I don't know if many are willing to sacrifice these aspects of their life to attain that. And so I always felt that if there was more flexibility, honestly, that was respected. It's one thing to say it. It's another thing to really respect that work from home and not diminish someone's contributions because of it. I think women wouldn't feel so conflicted that they had to make one sacrifice over the other. And ultimately, you'd find more women staying in the workforce. So to me, that could be very much a silver lining about COVID is now the respective flexible and remote work and the focus on results and metrics as a means to success. So I think that'll be good for women. And on the political thing, yeah, I hope so. I think, I've learned whether it's, on your board of ed or in your council, it's a really interesting way to see how the process works. And it's funny because your local government is a microcosm for the federal government. And if you understand how the works and it's very interesting. I now even have a much greater appreciation of the process when I read about what's happening at the congressional level, because I was like, oh yeah, we're just a small, very, very mini version of that. And it's been very helpful for me just to understand how everything works and why.
Shelley, I want to talk a bit about a conversation we were having before the show about leadership and the art of being humble and empathetic and understanding and flexible, but making sure that as we think about the new face of leadership, that we're not creating opportunities just to continue to check things off a box, right? So I would love your thoughts on what leadership should look like now.
Well, I think, so I always had these 3 pillars of leadership that I used to talk about and at HBO. And quite frankly, part of my experiment in the public sector is to see the same tenets of leadership that worked in the private sector. How does that translate to the public sector? And those 3 tenets were always about being, as a leader, you need to be very transparent with people, period, about everything. And not just about things that you might think are specific to their responsibilities, but you need to be transparent because not only does it create a community of trust, it also gives people context for decision making. And I think people need to understand the big picture so that when they're in a situation to make a decision about their role, they have context for that decision they're about to make and why. And the reason that's so important, because the second component of that is empowering people, right? And you hear it all the time. Surround yourself by really sweet, smart people and empower them to make the decisions, right? It takes a confident leader to be able to do that. And even though a lot of people talk about it, it's much harder to do than it is actually it's much harder to say than it is to actually do. Because, all right, if you've got surrounding these really smart people and you're empowering them to make these decisions because you've now given them context for the decision making, every leader's fear, I think, a lot of them is that they're going to be irrelevant. But ironically, your job as a leader is to ultimately make yourself irrelevant. And I would say in every job I ever had, my goal was like, okay, how can I make myself irrelevant in this job? But the third component of leadership is about accountability. And I think that's actually the scariest part of all for leaders. And if you really don't hold people accountable to not only just maybe some quantifiable metrics you agree on, but even like, does someone uphold your values? Do they, do they treat people well? Whatever you all mutually agree. If you don't hold them accountable, then there's no point in being transparent and empowering people, because I've seen it many times is that, people are very smart and they're very intuitive. And at the end of the day, if you do not want to really have the hard and difficult conversations with the poor performers, if you will, that poor performance is not lost on the other people in your organization, right? And at some point, instead of those superstars thinking like, okay, they're not going to keep carrying the slack, because it's not a reflection on the person who's not performing. It's a reflection upon the leader who's not managing it. And I think it's really important to deal with all of those issues in order to create an organization where everybody rises and they become accountable, not to you as a leader, they become accountable to each other to hold up the standards and expectations and the culture that you've created. And I think leaders don't often focus, like, I think they oftentimes you feed people that you always know the person that can't carry their weight. What do? They put them in a job where they think that, they're not going to make a difference, and it's and that's not lost on anybody else in the organization. And I think as a leader, it kind of diminishes your own credibility in doing that. So I think the best leaders are those that have the courage to operate on all of those three principles and truly act on it and follow the lead then of the organization and let them see where that takes you. And I think leaders define themselves sometimes, well, if it's not me out front, people are going to question why I'm here. And it's the exact opposite.
As you're talking, I'm thinking through, like, how do you then operationalize all of this, right? And how do you ensure that all of the different systems and departments and functions within a company have the right mechanisms and the tools and the assessments in place to be able to do what you just said? And in my mind, I'm thinking about annual performance appraisals, right? Because when we think about accountability, that's often the one mechanism by which employees know that they're being measured and judged, right? And ranked and graded and et cetera, right? So I'm wondering, what can leaders do to really rethink everything from how our employees brought on from that first day of their experience on said job, then to the tenure of their lifespan with the company, particularly as we think about, like, how are we now supposed to hold people accountable in kind of this crazy mishmash of mess that we have in 2020 and beyond? And do we need to hold people accountable in different ways? And then how do we communicate that to them where they actually feel ownership of that accountability, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I have to say, I think this notion of the annual, semi-annual performance reviews is a little dated. And I almost think in so doing, it gives permission for leaders and managers to feel like, well, I'm going to wait till June to deliver that, have that conversation, or December. And oftentimes the best feedback is given in the moment with very specific examples so that someone can change. But it goes back to the culture that you try to create in an organization. Like, I'll give you a perfect example of something I did at HBO. And so I was really trying to create this culture of collaboration and innovation and trust, right, amongst all the different groups in my area. And I found that, let's just say from an account specific, I would have department groups set up by account. And there'd be one, the businesses always change, and you could be working on an account that ends up being an amazing account, oftentimes by just what's happening in the marketplace, right? And then you have another one that's really struggling, which has nothing to do with the effort of the people working on it. It just has to do with a straight change in strategy by that account. So it didn't make sense to me that the folks that were working, had the benefit of working on these star accounts, seemed to always be rewarded. So I changed how people were rewarded. I said, if we don't meet our as our whole company, we don't meet our revenue goals, you don't get credit for meeting yours either. And now there's like other measures and so forth. You don't get credit for meeting yours either. And so so rather than me telling people, well, why don't you go help so-and-so on this account, by nature and upending how we rewarded people, it naturally created this incentive for them to start working together. And it also created that whole we're all in this together mode. And how can I help you? And the reason that's important, going back to your question about feedback, is once you create this culture of we're all in this together, and you've had the courage to deal with those that aren't pulling their weight, you can start looking at feedback for what it's intended. And that is to help people, not necessarily unjustly criticize people. And so what would happen is, and we empowered everybody, including the assistants. So what would happen is that we would have meetings, and someone would stop someone after a meeting and say, hey, you know what, Joe, that meeting, you might have wanted to say it this way or do it that way. But because of the spirit that we created in the department, Joe wasn't mad about that feedback. He understood the spirit in which it was intended. So by the time you got to performance review time, it was like all old news. And I think and for us, but the objectives, to your point, have to be measured. And like I said, there's quantifiable goals, whether you're an operating role, revenue, and all that kind of stuff. And it has to be how you show up and what that looks like, right? And how you handle feedback, how you give feedback, how you lead people, what they say about you. I think there's a bunch of ways that you can do that. And I think in this COVID world, more importantly, I think you're going to need people have to be more proactive in a COVID world. And I think that would have to be built into some of the expectations for people, because I think it's easy for many people we all want to crawl in a corner. And I think I think you need to create some level of accountability for forcing people to collaborate, communicate, and reach out.
I think that there's also a, this kind of unique moment in time too, where we're giving people the space to be able to crawl in a corner for a day if they need to crawl into a corner for a day, right? Like understanding that we're not all on the same page, we're not all experiencing this in the same way, particularly because for the most part now we're a global economy, if not just even nationally. And even nationally, we're kind of in different places and spaces in terms of how we're experiencing COVID. I'm going to go back to your thoughts on ambition, and as that pertains to women's interpretation and definition and meanings that they associate with that. And, is there a different way to define ambition? Are we just defining it in the wrong way in the sense of how we think about and position that word within the corporate context? Is there a different way to actually talk about ambition so that we don't feel, for women that choose for whatever reason to opt out of the workforce, that we don't feel like we've lost that ambition? Do you know what I mean? Like there's a yeah.
Yeah. That's actually a good question. Because, people think ambition and they think of, ladder climbers and that kind of thing. But you're right. I think, ambition, I think, is to be really the best version of yourself and whatever that is you choose to do. Right. And I think, you're right. I think that's a really good way to look at it as far as, I am an ambitious, I'm a philanthropist or an ambitious, I don't know, whatever it may be. But yeah, you're right. I think it has had connotations that, and not, especially for women, not necessarily great ones. And I think that's a good conversation, actually.
That's a whole different show. We'll invite
you. It is. That's a hard one. That's actually, you know what? Honestly, you probably have to even call it something else. You're asking people to disassociate all these things that have been lined up with ambition that aren't necessarily have been great for women. How do you pivot that to something that's right?
Well, and it's interesting because we were having just a conversation on one of our tapings earlier today where we were talking about growth and scale. And from an entrepreneurial perspective, to raise capital, investors want to see growth and scale. They want to see, a 10x return. They want to see a lot of data that doesn't necessarily get to the heart of the matter of why a woman launches a business, right?
Yeah.
And so, in what ways can we actually reclaim some of these words and some of these phrases for ourselves, like, the word ambition, for example, and, reinvent and reimagine what that could look like, and incorporate that into some principles that could become a part of the new world economy.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to say, this is, again, I think, an opportunity from COVID, because I think women, especially when you talk about entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and that kind of thing, you shy away from using value-based words, right? Because they sound soft, like compassion and empathy and all those kinds of things. But those things are actually what make women, I think, in particular, great leaders, right? So, but what's interesting, I think one thing we are seeing in COVID and a lot from corporations, we're seeing them act much more compassionately towards their employees. Right? Like either in helping, I think, with school, and they seem to finally understanding the challenges that so many of these, employees are facing with, just trying to juggle it all. And maybe, I don't know, maybe there's an opportunity to to own some of those things about in going forward that could be seen now as benefits as opposed to something that you're always kind of shied away from. And no longer are women going to have to pretend like it isn't hard to juggle, family and work and all those other things, because it's been all open for everyone to see from both men and women. And what's great is all these men in leadership experience, roles are seeing and experiencing it themselves. So I think being able to talk about it openly, I think maybe that can create some new terminology, I think, that we're allowed to talk about and that we value.
One of the things I know that women often struggle with too is that we have a tendency to get very deep into details.
Too much so. Yes.
And yet your experience is so fascinating because you've led massive multi-billion-dollar transformations. You launched HBO Go, which I'm a big fan of HBO Go and HBO Now. What a transformation in the sense of how we just consume content, original content. What's been some ways that you've been able to maintain kind of that macro versus micro perspective to know what moments and times do you stay that visionary versus what moments and times do you need to get further down in the details, and what advice do you have for women who tend to get stuck in the details?
They do. And I'm not a detail person, but I like to surround myself with people who are. I carry a notebook around with me. I've never taken notes. I also sit in a meeting and I see everybody else is taking notes. I'm like, okay, well, why do I need to take the notes when I see everybody around is doing it too? And I do see it. You're right. It's an issue more with women. And I think sometimes, we are that definition of where, where perfect is the enemy of the good. And I've seen examples myself, like, that whole story. And it was in one of those, I can't remember who wrote about it, but they talk about how girls and boys in school, and why boys are inherently become, quite frankly, braver and taking risks later on in life, because even starting in elementary school, boys have a hard time sitting still. We're just wired that way, right? So the girls, are taking the notes and getting the A's. And what happens when boys don't, listen to the teacher? Worst case, they get called out, maybe terrible, they get sent to the principal, and then they go back to class. And you know what they discover happened for that? Nothing, right? Ultimately, really nothing material. But meanwhile, girls kept getting the positive reinforcement for sitting up straight and raising their hand and getting straight A's. And then what happens? So that's how women have been conditioned, right? To continually get rewarded for those details that you mentioned. Boys have learned early on that they've kind of, maybe not always done the right thing, and big deal, right? So then you get in the workforce, and I remember examples of, like, I'd have a guy come to my office with a presentation or whatever. And I'd be like, no, do this and make this change, right? He'd come back 3 hours later. I'd be great, perfect, run with it. I would say the thing to a woman, I wouldn't see her for a week. And she'd come back with the most perfect, detailed, presentation, all details. And you know what? The opportunity was gone. And so I really try to drill that into women. And I think they're getting better, but yes, we are our own worst enemy that way. And I've just never been a real detailed person. I much prefer big picture stuff, but yeah. I'd say be big picture, but surround yourself with those that like, I know what my weaknesses are. Like, I know, oh crap, I'm not going to be I'm not reading that whole spreadsheet, but I'm going to have Linda do it. She's on it. So no, I just think as leaders, you just need to know where your blind spots are and surround yourselves by people who will make up for that. And don't be the person that has to do it all.
There's so many really good tidbits of what you were just saying, in the sense of, understanding what your weaknesses are, and then hiring people who are better equipped, more advanced, more patient with understanding that level of detail, and surround yourself with those people. I think sometimes that's also hard for women because, again, stereotyping, and of course there are exceptions to this, but I think that sometimes also we have a difficult time giving up that control. Right? Because we feel like we're the master of everything, and then simultaneously then of nothing, right? In large part, that has to do with really getting comfortable in your own skin and really understanding and valuing what's really your strengths and play to those. And also being really honest to your point about admitting what you're weak in, like admitting what you don't like to do, admitting what makes you feel terrible in the sense of having to do it over and over and over again. And then finding other people that really shine in those spaces. And I think that's really hard for women to accept.
And you know what is pervert? You're absolutely right. For me, I'll never forget if any woman that's been a leadership role and then's gone on maternity leave. And that fear of, oh my gosh, they're going to find out they don't really need me, right? And that, instead of being a scary moment, that should be a very liberating moment. And for a lot of women, But you're right. I think that is, and that it's perverse because that level of control that can make you so, can be a real reason why you get rewarded in your career. At some point, it becomes a liability. And I think pivoting from that, and I think a lot of women go, wait a minute, how come that guy got that job when nobody's ever told me, and I have to say, like, now I'm going to be generalizing too. I always tell women, don't be the get the coffee person. I've been in meetings with women who have the executive title, right? And we're in meetings and it's always the woman that says, I'm going to go get the coffee. And I'm like, no, don't be the get the coffee person. Because I've also seen men surround themselves by women and give them the title so that woman is the get the coffee person. But that same woman is never going to be the woman that they put in the C-suite because she has diminished her own sense of having a seat at the table by thinking she's doing all the right things. Right. And I think that's and it's hard to see when that becomes a liability, right? And yeah, I've seen it happen way too many times. So I always kick people, when you can take turns getting the coffee, but don't be the one that chimes up and says, let me go get the coffee.
And can I add to that as well? Don't be the one who cleans up after the meeting.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. But I'll say one thing too about that point about control. And it goes back to a comment I made earlier about making yourself irrelevant. And I am not kidding. Every job I had, I'm like, okay. And I think it actually comes honestly from an inherent laziness I have. Like, okay, really? Why do I need to do that job? And I got all these really smart people who can do it. And then maybe one day I don't need to do it anymore and I can go off to the sunset. But the perverse thing is every time I went in to go, and I was usually the person that had the fixer. I had to go and fix problems, right? And I'd go and I'd get it all, and it's all set up by creating a culture and staff and leaders, right? And then my job is done. Every time I was ready for my job to be done, they said, okay, they moved me up to the next one. And you have to have confidence that in so doing and setting up those next leaders in that culture, that you will get rewarded for that. You don't, it's not like they suddenly say, oh, we don't need her anymore. It's like, oh, no, we actually now need her to go take care of this problem. And usually it's a bigger problem, right? And that's how you end up in the C-suite. It's all an accident.
It really, truly is.
Well, but it is. It's because I never really wanted it. That was the irony. It's not something I ever aspired to. And that's what I tell people. That's the irony. When you operate as if you don't care and you're courageous and be the one that speaks truth to power, you will often get rewarded for that.
Do you think that's also because and again, stereotyping and generalizing, but many women often wrap up so much of their identity and so much of their personal self in their job
value.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there's so much of an emotional connection to it that then it becomes more difficult for you to stay objective to your career.
Yeah.
So much of your emotions wrapped up into it. But what I hear you saying, there's a bit of a difference in the sense of a bit more of a detachment and letting things come as they may, seizing and being very smart about the opportunities and doing a kick-ass job, but also coming to it from a very different perspective where it's not fully defining who you are.
And I think that's so important. And it's funny. There's a book by Clayton Christensen who wrote Innovator's Dilemma. He also wrote a book called How Will You Measure Your Life? And he was the first person when I read that book that explained my own career trajectory to me, because he never wanted to be this renowned author. He wanted to go and be like the publisher of the Wall Street Journal. And he talked about, and as a result, every job he had wasn't really the job he really wanted. So he could do it very fearlessly. And ironically, everything kept getting rewarded. But there's a very important part too, and it's very relevant. We're talking about money, right, and business, and it is about women and money. And to your point about how women often can define themselves by their, professional success. Men do too, I think maybe even more so. But I think we tend to look for that validation. Mm-hmm. But I always tell people, do not live don't ever try to live beyond your means, and never try to. I live in the same house I've ever owned. Don't define yourself by external success and what people think of you, because if you never want to live beyond your means, and you never want to live up to the next promotion, because when you are financially secure, you are able to operate fearlessly, because you are not thinking, oh my gosh, I have to stick with this bad boss, or I have to stick here because, oh my God, we just bought the big house or the second house and so forth, and I need the paycheck. I always operated like I wanted to be able to walk out the door tomorrow if there was any situation that I wasn't going to be happy with. And I feel like the most empowering thing women can do is make sure that they live within their means. And it gives you courage.
That is such good advice. And I think that if there's a few different things that COVID has taught us, is that that's a stark reminder of, we're all obviously spending a lot less money because we're not going to Broadway shows, we're not going out to dinners, we're maybe not commuting in the same way that we commuted in the past. I haven't been to the dry cleaner in, I don't know, 6 months now.
Yes.
But I think what this time period is also causing us to do is to really reconsider truly what's important. And, how we really do, to your point, like, want to create our legacy. Like, at the end of the day, do we want to be remembered? Another question for you is, I'm thinking about this as I'm listening to you, and what I hear also is that sometimes we get so defined by our resume, and we get so defined by the roles and the jobs that we hold, and we're amazing women, right? All of us, and so of course we give our 200% to something, but often we get stuck in the trap where there's a difference between knowing that you're really good at something and continuing it down that path because you know that you're really good at it, versus taking a risk and shifting to a different path that may bring a lot more fear and anxiety and uncertainty, but something that may be much more meaningful and fulfilling to us in the long run.
Yeah, I know what that's all about. So, yeah, no, I have to tell you, I mean, going back to my decision to leave HBO, it was those things. And it was also because I had been in a place for so long in a culture that was so innate to me, and the relationships I had were so innate. I started doubting whether, like, okay, was this just a fluke? Was my success here just a fluke because, it was just a measure of the time when I was there? Or is my success here in terms of leadership and everything else transferable? Is it? And so there was that part of me that wanted to see, of all the things I was talking to companies about and my own organization about, does it work outside of the confines of this very familiar place? And that was also something, one of the factors that went into my decision to run for mayor, like, in probably how do these skills work in probably the most challenging environment in public, both between public sector and public sector employees and the community. And that's been very validating for me and very confidence building, quite frankly, to make me think like, okay, whatever I do next, okay, these skills are legit. I think I can tell people I have value to add, but I don't know whether I would have really been confidently able to say that unless I had taken the leap.
I want to skip around a little bit now and talk about just the theme of content. And when you were at HBO Go was very innovative at the time. And who knew there would be a period of time where we'd all be watching TV shows on our phones or on our laptops or whatever digital device we carry around with us 24/7. And so wondering, from your perspective, in the sense of where you sit now, where do you see the white space? Like, where do you think there's still possibility for innovation?
Well, everything is about storytelling, right? Everything. And brands, like, you see it how, and it's funny, like, even coming to public sector, I couldn't help but talk about my town in the context of, like, a brand, right? And storytelling. And I think that content is going to be, as it already is starting to be, it's going to be in everything, right? And I think that's where the innovate. I think there's still a lot of innovation in that space, but not related to traditional storytelling like movies and TV, but in how we live our lives. And I think that there's so much. I think anything that we do, in any product or service that we contemplate, has to have a story to tell, and it has to be some in ways that people can personalize it and relate it. And I think there's a tremendous amount of innovation still to be had in that place.
It's also maybe it's almost more like less of the big splashy and more of the, in what ways can I relate with someone else's lived experience?
That's exactly right. And yes, I completely agree. And in a very relatable way, not the cinematographer way, but in a very relatable way, right? And that also speaks to what we talked about earlier about this notion of, I think, of values is becoming increasingly important in terms of the products that people want, where people want to work, and the products that they want to purchase. And I think where the content comes into that is a way to really help define what the values are of any of those places.
I can't also help but wonder, this is 2020 and we're 40 something days out from the election now. And, and, it's been a really interesting way, I think, for social media platforms to be our best allies and our worst enemies, in the sense of, how they produce original content and then stream it out to the masses. And we know that a lot of it's not always actually accurate, right? What, from your perspective, going forward, knowing what we know, what do brands need to do differently to really win the hearts and minds of their end users? I won't even say consumers. I'll say from their networks, from the people that they're stakeholders, let's say stakeholders, to be able to do it in a different way where it actually does come from a place of truth and not from a place of persuasion.
That is such a good question. And if I had all the answers to that, that would be great. I have to tell you, the level of cynicism among people is beyond discouraging. And that's a really good question. I mean, people just aren't believing anything. And I mean, just pretty much and nobody believes anything anymore. And social media has definitely played a big role in that. That to me, if you ask me where the opportunity is, there's some way that brands are going to have to figure that out in terms of how do you get back to a place where you are a trusted source of information about your own brand. I guess it'll have to be experiential, but I don't know. It's I think this year in particular has got us to probably such a low place that I think there's an opportunity for, I don't know if it's a new platform. I don't know what it is, but I can tell you this current thing, I don't see it sustainable the way we're operating. I just don't.
Now I want to skip again one more time to one of my favorite parts of the show, the lightning round.
Uh-oh.
All right, so piggybacking off that last question, maybe I should mix this around a little bit differently in my mind. Fast forward 1 year from now. What is your hope for the role you currently hold? I get very excited about what I see in a year from now. Like, I believe that once we get through this, we're going to see a whole new wave of innovation, both in my community and around the country. And I get really excited about that. So I think all of those things that I've talked about, the reasons I ran for mayor, are going to really be visibly come to fruition by this time next year. And I think it's going to give, and I think around the country, I think we're going to go from a place of despair to an incredible place of hope. And I see that happening within a year. I love that. And I agree. I think that and look, no matter whatever happens in November happens.
Yeah.
But when we think about, and this is on such a different level, but when we think about what happened in 2007, 2008 with the Great Recession, what it managed to do is create a whole different class of unicorns, right? So when we think about the way in which the sharing economy sprung from the ashes of the Great Recession, and tremendous companies that have really pivoted how we think about so many different things, like Uber, for example, is, when you think about Uber, like they literally own no cars, right? So when you think about that as a business model, or Rent the Runway, or, all of the food packaging systems where you don't necessarily ever have to shop for food again. You can just have, Blue Apron, et cetera, delivered to your doorstep.
Right.
So I think it's going to be fascinating to see what comes from this period of time in the sense of where we think about innovation. Of course, technology is going to have to play a part of it.
Totally.
But I think that, from the work that you're doing in the sense of how do you really envision a different type of community spirit and a different way by which you bring people together, I see that, honestly, Shelley, like happening in so many different spaces that we're a part of as well, and our ecosystem as well. We have incredibly diverse.
It would be a shame if we get through this and we don't see that type of innovation happening in all those places.
Right.
I mean, it's like I said, education. You need some really bold leadership to leverage this to move it forward in all those places.
Mm-hmm. When you think about healthcare and education and the sharing sort of aspect of things, it's not going to be the sharing economy, and as we know it in 1.0 version, but what's the 2.0 version of that in the sense of how we create and sustain communities, both in the ways in which we can actually come together in person, and what does that look like to be able to do more of that, even in winter months, but still have it be very, very safe.
That's right.
And really shift the dialogue around how do we really protect ourselves. It was interesting. We were interviewing a U.S. citizen who lives in Munich. I think this was just one of the last week's tapings. And we were talking about the differences in the sense of how the German culture has embraced even simple things like wearing a mask in different ways than what we have here.
Yeah.
Right. And their spirit is more about, yes, I'm protecting myself, but I'm also protecting everyone else around me because I care about everyone else around me.
Right.
I might not agree with them, but I care about whether or not they're healthy or not. Right. And we're not at that place yet.
No.
But I'm hoping, to your point, like we learn something.
That rugged individualism can come back to bite us, right? And I do think that's the places that seem to be successful is that it's like we just have to learn to live with it, right? And so the way we get our life back is that we just got to learn to live with it, and that is by wearing masks and doing all those things. Because when there's a vaccine, it's not like you're going to turn on a light switch and everything goes. And I was telling my kids, I guarantee you, 2 to 3 years, you'll be walking around New York City and there'll be some people with masks on and you won't look at them twice. It's just, that's just going to be the way it is. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I agree with you. Someone told me I'm a communitarian at heart, which is why as mayor, you get a lot of, you've heard of NIMBY, not in my backyard. And I do have a really, really hard time empathizing with some of that because I believe we live in a very dense community in a very densely populated state, and we all kind of have to give a little for the greater good of everybody, right? So it's hard for me to empathize with that mindset because I am as of the mindset you described. And I wish more people were.
It's my hope that more people become more embracing of that philosophy in the sense of we're all kind of in this together, and the sooner that we group together and figure out how to get over it and protect ourselves and to protect others, then we can actually possibly
move on
at some point in the future, eat together in a restaurant inside.
Yes, exactly.
Shelley, two more lightning round questions for you.
Yeah.
If you had to describe 2020 in 3 words or less, how would you describe it?
I can't, no swear words allowed, right? Okay, I would say hopeful. Challenging, I guess, is a boring word, but I can't think of any other way to say it, right? don't know. I don't know what the one word is this, but there's something about this year that is rooting us back to remind us of values driven, I guess. Reminding it, and maybe it's simplicity, is I think there's something about this, going back to what you said earlier, that is bringing us back to remind us about what's important. Let's focus on materialism, focus on family, community, health. And I hope it becomes a year that realigns our values a bit to invest our time and resources accordingly.
I love values realignment. I think that's so
that's
powerful. I asked someone else this question a couple of weeks ago, and her response was, "Oh my God."
Well, I always said that when you asked me the question, because
Final question: what advice would you give to your 85-year-old self today?
To give myself a break, I have to say. I have this mindset of just like, we have such little time on this earth. We got to like always be making a difference or that kind of thing. And I think, I think sometimes I'll look back and say, you know what, you could cut yourself some slack. So I'm pretty sure that's what I would say to myself. So now I have 30 years to make that happen.
It's so interesting. In months number 1 through maybe 3 or 4 of COVID, everyone was saying, just do what you need to do to stay healthy, just stay healthy, just stay healthy. And now we're, in month 6. And I think to your point, I think many of us feel, oh my gosh, I'm behind. The year's almost over. But yet it's, we're living in a very historic moment in time, and to really be able to cut yourself a break and practice some self-care and, use this time when we're in our homes to, if you want to go for a walk during the middle of the afternoon, go for a walk, because chances are we're going to be working late anyway. So.
and cut a break to those around you. Cut your kids a break. It really is. I think I agree, and I hope that's something that we keep with us after this.
Shelley, thank you so much for being with us today. You need to come back because I have so many more questions for you. So
good. It'd be fun. Yeah, maybe we can have that. What happened? I can tell you what happened a year from now. And see where
exactly. It's so funny because we think of often these episodes as little time capsules. Where in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, we'll look back and watch and we'll be like, wow, we all really went through that together. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's so true, right?
Thank you, Shelley, for being with us today. And thank you, everyone, for staying with us. I'm Jan Mershadams, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. Please make sure to check us out at joinmayshad.com and become a part of the way in which we revolutionize how professional women connect, engage, and do business together. And subscribe to our YouTube channel and stay up to date on all of our Women in Money, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Speak Your Mind episodes. Thanks, everyone. See you soon. Bye.